It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 8. I don't pretend to be a very educated man, except maybe educated in the heart and in being able to feel for the sorrows and the fears of every ornery fellow human being. Still in all, I've read the Bible through from kiver to kiver, like my wife's folks say down in Arkansas, some 11 times. I've read all the law books they've printed, and as to contemporaries, I don't guess I've missed much of all the grand literature produced by Bruce Barton, Edgar Guest, Arthur Brisbane, Elizabeth Dilling, Walter Pitkin, and William Dudley Pelley. This last gentleman I honor not only for his rattling good yarns and his serious work in investigating life beyond the grave, and absolutely proven that only a blind fool could fail to believe in personal immortality, but finally for his public-spirited and self-sacrificing work in founding the Silver Shirts. These true knights, even if they did not attain quite all the success they deserved, were one of our most noble and Galahad-like attempts to combat the snaky, sinister, surreptitious, seditious plots of the Red Radicals and other sour brands of Bolsheviks that incessantly threaten the American standards of liberty, high wages, and universal security. These fellows have messages, and we haven't got time for anything in literature except a straight, hard-hitting, hot-throbbing message. 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. During the very first week of his campaign, Senator Windrip clarified his philosophy by issuing his distinguished proclamation, The 15 Points of Victory for the Forgotten Men. The 15 planks, in his own words, or maybe in Lee Saracen's words, or Dewey Hake's words, were these. Number 1, all finance in the country, including banking, insurance, stocks and bonds, and mortgages, shall be under the absolute control of a federal central bank, owned by the government and conducted by a board appointed by the President, which board shall, without need of recourse to Congress for legislative authorization, be empowered to make all regulations governing finance. Thereafter, as soon as may be practicable, this board shall consider the nationalization and government ownership for the profit of the whole people of all mines, oil fields, water power, public utilities, transportation, and communication. Number 2, the President shall appoint a commission equally divided between manual workers, employers, and representatives of the public to determine which labor unions are qualified to represent the workers and report to the executive. For legal action, all pretended labor organizations, whether company unions or red unions, controlled by communists and the so-called Third International. The duly recognized unions shall be constituted bureaus of the government with power of decision in all labor disputes. Later, the same investigation and official recognition shall be extended to farm organizations. In this elevation of the position of the worker, it shall be emphasized that the League of Forgotten Men is the chief bulwark against the menace of destructive and un-American radicalism. Number 3, in contradistinction to the doctrines of the Red Radicals, with their felonious expropriation of the arduously acquired possessions which ensure to aged persons their security, this league and party will guarantee private initiative and the right to private property for all time. Number 4, believing that only under God Almighty, to whom we render all homage, do we Americans hold our vast power, we shall guarantee to all persons absolute freedom of religious worship, provided, however, that no atheist, agnostic, believer in black magic, nor any Jew who shall refuse to swear allegiance to the New Testament, nor any person of any faith who refuses to take the pledge to the flag shall be permitted to hold any public office or to practice as a teacher, professor, lawyer, judge, or as a physician, except in the category of obstetrics. Number 5, annual net income per person shall be limited to $500,000. No accumulated fortune may at any one time exceed $3 million per person. No one person shall, during his lifetime, be permitted to retain an inheritance or various inheritances in total exceeding $2 million. All incomes or estates in excess of the sums named shall be seized by the federal government for use in relief and in administrative expenses. Number 6. Profits shall be taken out of war by seizing all dividends over and above 6% that shall be received from the manufacture, distribution, or sale during wartime of all arms, munitions, aircraft, ships, tanks, and all other things directly applicable to warfare, as well as from food, textiles, and all other supplies furnished to the American or to any allied army. Number 7. Our armaments and the size of our military and naval establishments shall be consistently enlarged until they shall equal, but since this country has no desire for foreign conquest of any kind, not surpass in every branch of the forces of defense the martial strength of any other single country or empire in the world. Upon inauguration, this league and party shall make this its first obligation, together with the issuance of a firm proclamation to all nations of the world that our armed forces are to be maintained solely for the purposes of ensuring world peace and amity. Number 8. Congress shall have the sole right to issue money, and immediately upon our inauguration it shall at least double the present supply of money in order to facilitate the fluidity of credit. Number 9. We cannot too strongly condemn the unchristian attitude of certain otherwise progressive nations and their discriminations against the Jews, who have been among the strongest supporters of the League and who will continue to prosper and to be recognized as fully Americanized, though only so long as they continue to support our ideals. Number 10. All Negroes shall be prohibited from voting, holding public office, practicing law, medicine, or teaching in any class above the grade of grammar school, and they shall be taxed 100% of all sums in excess of $10,000 per family per year, which they may earn or in any other manner receive. In order, however, to give the most sympathetic aid possible to all Negroes who comprehend their proper and valuable place in society, all such colored persons, male or female, as can prove that they have devoted not less than 45 years to such suitable tasks as domestic service, agricultural labor, and common labor in industries, shall at the age of 65 be permitted to appear before a special board, composed entirely of white persons, and upon proof that while employed they have never been idle except through sickness, they shall be recommended for pensions not to exceed the sum of $500 per person per year, nor to exceed $700 per family. Negroes shall, by definition, be persons with at least 1/16 colored blood. Number 11. Far from opposing such high-minded and economically sound methods of the relief of poverty, unemployment, and old age as the epic plan of the Honorable Upton Sinclair, the share the wealth and every man a king proposals of the late Honorable Huey Long to assure every family $5,000 a year, the Townsend Plan, the Utopian Plan, technocracy, and all competent schemes of unemployment insurance, a commission shall be immediately appointed by the new administration to study, reconcile, and recommend for immediate adoption the best features in these several plans for Social Security, and the Honorable Messrs. Sinclair, Townsend, Eugene Reed, and Howard Scott are herewith invited to in every way advise and collaborate with that commission. Number 12. All women now employed shall, as rapidly as possible, except in such particularly feminine spheres of activity as nursing and beauty parlors, be assisted to return to their incomparably sacred duties as homemakers and as mothers of strong, honorable future citizens of the Commonwealth. Number 13. Any person advocating communism, socialism, or anarchism, advocating refusal to enlist in the case of war, or advocating alliance with Russia in any war whatsoever, shall be subject to trial for high treason, with a minimum penalty of 20 years at hard labor in prison, and a maximum of death on the gallows or other form of execution which the judges may find convenient. Number 14. All bonuses promised to former soldiers of any war in which America has ever engaged shall be immediately paid in full, in cash, and in all cases of veterans with incomes of less than $5,000 a year, the formerly promised sums shall be doubled. Number 15. Congress shall immediately upon our inauguration initiate amendments to the Constitution, providing A, that the President shall have the authority to institute and execute all necessary measures for the conduct of the government during this critical epoch, B, that Congress shall serve only in an advisory capacity, calling to the attention of the President and his aides and Cabinet any needed legislation, but not acting upon same until authorized by the President so to act, and C, that the Supreme Court shall immediately have removed from its jurisdiction the power to negate, by ruling them to be unconstitutional or by any other judicial action, any or all acts of the President, his duly appointed aides, or Congress. Addendum. It shall be strictly understood that as the League of Forgotten Men in the Democratic Party is now constituted, have no purpose nor desire to carry out any measure that shall not unqualifiedly meet with the desire of the majority of voters of these United States, the League and Party regard none of the above 15 points as obligatory and unmodifiable except number 15, and upon the others they will act or refrain from acting in accordance with the general desire of the public, who shall, under the new regime, be again granted an individual freedom of which they have been deprived by the harsh and restrictive economic measures of former administrations, both Republican and Democratic. "But what does it mean?" marveled Mrs. Jessup, when her husband had read the platform to her. "It's so inconsistent. Sounds like a combination of Norman Thomas and Calvin Coolidge. I don't seem to understand it. I wonder if Mr. Windrip understands it himself." "Sure, you bet he does. It mustn't be supposed that because Windrip gets that intellectual dressmaker Saracen to prettify up his ideas for him, he doesn't recognize them and clasp them to his bosom when they're dolled up in $2 words. I'll tell you just what it all means. Articles 1 and 5 mean that if the financiers and transportation kings and so on don't come through heavily with support for Buzz, they may be threatened with bigger income taxes and some control of their businesses. But they are coming through, I hear, handsomely. They're paying for Buzz's radio and his parades. 2, that by controlling their unions directly, Buzz's gang can kidnap all labor into slavery. 3, backs up the security for big capital, and 4, brings the preachers into line as scared and unpaid press agents for Buzz. 6 doesn't mean anything at all. Munitions firms with vertical trusts will be able to wrangle 6% on manufacture, 1 on transportation, and 1 on sales at least. 7 means we'll get ready to follow all the European nations in trying to hog the whole world. 8 means that by inflation, big industrial companies will be able to buy their outstanding bonds back at a cent on the dollar. And 9, that all Jews who don't cough up plenty of money for the robber baron will be punished, even including the Jews who haven't much to cough up. 10, that all well-paying jobs and businesses held by Negroes will be grabbed by the poor white trash among Buzz worshippers. And that instead of being denounced, they'll be universally praised as patriotic protectors of racial purity. 11, that Buzz will be able to pass the buck for not creating any real relief for poverty. 12, that the women who will later lose the vote and the right to higher education and be foxed out of all decent jobs and urged to rear soldiers to be killed in foreign wars. 13, that anybody who opposes Buzz in any way at all can be called a communist and scragged for it. Why, under this clause, Hoover and Al Smith and Ogden Mills, yes, and you and me will all be communists. 14, that Buzz thinks enough of the sport of the veterans' vote to be willing to pay high for it in other people's money. And 15, well, that's the one loan clause that really does mean something, and it means that Windrip and Lee Saracen and Bishop Prang, and I guess maybe this Colonel Dewey Hake and this Dr. Hector McGoblin, this doctor that helps write the high-minded hymns for Buzz, they've realized that this country has gone so flabby that any gang daring enough and unscrupulous enough and smart enough not to seem illegal can grab hold of the entire government and have all the power and applause and salutes, all the money in the palaces and will and women they want. They're only a handful, but just think how small Lenin's gang was at first, and Mussolini's and Hitler's and Kemal Pasha's and Napoleon's. You'll see all the liberal preachers and modernist educators and discontented newspapermen and farm agitators. Maybe they'll worry at first, but they'll get caught up in the web of propaganda like we all were in the Great War, and they'll all be convinced that even if our Buzzy maybe has got a few faults, he's on the side of the plain people and against all the tight old political machines, and they'll rouse the country for him as the great liberator, and meanwhile big business will just wink and sit tight. And then, by God, this crook, I don't know whether he's more of a crook or hysterical religious fanatic, along with Saracen and Hake and Prang and McGoblin. These 5 men will be able to set up a regime that'll remind you of Henry Morgan the pirate capturing a merchant ship. "But will Americans stand for it long?" whimpered Emma. "Oh no, not people like us, the descendants of the pioneers." "Dunno. I'm going to try to see that they don't, of course. You understand that you and I and Sissy and Fowler and Mary will probably be shot if I do try to do anything. I sound brave enough now, but probably I'll be scared to death when I hear Buzz's private troops go marching by." "Oh, you will be careful, won't you?" begged Emma. "Oh, before I forget it, how many times must I tell you, Dormouse, not to give foolish chicken bones? They'll stick in his poor throat and choke him to death. And you just never remember to take the keys out of the car when you leave it and put it in the garage at night. I'm perfectly sure that Shad Ledoux or somebody will steal it one of these nights." Father Stephen Parafix, when he read the 15 points, was considerably angrier than Doremus. He snorted, "What? Negroes, Jews, women, they all banned, and they leave us Catholics out this time? Hitler didn't neglect us, he's persecuted us. Must be that Charlie Coughlin, he's made us too respectable." Sissy, who was eager to go to a school of architecture and become a creator of new styles in houses of glass and steel, Lorinda Pike, who had plans for Carlsbad, Vichy, Saratoga in Vermont, Mrs. Candy, who aspired to a home bakery of her own when she should be too old for domestic labor, they were all of them angrier than either Doremus or Father Parafix. Sissy sounded not like a flirtatious girl, but like a battling woman as she snarled, "So, the League of Forgotten Men is going to make us a League of Forgotten Women! Send us back to washing diapers and leaching out ashes for soap. Let us read Louisa May Alcott and Barry, except on the Sabbath, of course. Let us sleep in humble gratitude with men." "Sissy," wailed her mother. "Like Shad Ledoux. Well, Dad, you can sit right down and write busy Berzelius for me that I'm going to England on the next boat." Mrs. Candy stopped drying the water glasses with the soft dish towels, which he scrupulously washed out daily, long enough to croak, "What nasty men! I hope they get shot soon," which for Mrs. Candy was a startling, long, and humanitarian statement. "Yes, nasty enough, but what I've got to keep remembering is that Windrip is only the lightest cork on the whirlpool. He didn't plot all this thing with all the justified discontent there is against the smart politicians and plush horses of plutocracy. Oh, if it hadn't been one Windrip, it'd been another. We had it coming, we respectables, but that isn't going to make us like it," thought Doremus. End of Chapter 8. It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 9. Those who have never been on the inside in councils of the state can never realize that with really high-class statesmen, their chief quality is not political canniness, but a big, rich, overflowing love for all sorts and conditions of people and for the whole land. That love and that patriotism have been my soul-guiding principles in politics. My one ambition is to get all Americans to realize that they are and must continue to be the greatest race on the face of this old earth, and second, to realize that whatever apparent differences there may be among us in wealth, knowledge, skill, ancestry, or strength, of course this does not apply to people who are racially different than us, we are all brothers, bound together in a great and wonderful bond of national unity, for which we should all be very glad. And I think we ought to, for this, be willing to sacrifice any individual gains at all. 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. Berzelius Windrip, of whom in the late summer and early autumn of 1936 there were so many published photographs showing him popping into cars and out of aeroplanes, dedicating bridges, eating corn pone and side meat with Southerners and clam chowder and bran with Northerners, addressing the American Legion, the Liberty League, the YMHA, the Young People's Socialist League, the Elks, the Bartenders and Waiters Union, the Anti-Saloon League, the Society for the Propagation of the Gospel in Afghanistan, and showing him kissing lady centenarians and shaking hands with ladies called Madam, but never the opposite, showing him in Savile Row riding clothes on Long Island and in overalls and a khaki shirt in the Ozarks. This Buzz Windrip was almost a dwarf, yet an enormous head, a bloodhound head, of huge ears, pendulous cheeks, mournful eyes. He had a luminous, ungrudging smile, which declared the Washington correspondents he turned on and off deliberately like an electric light, but which could make his ugliness more attractive than the simpers of any pretty man. His hair was so coarse and black and straight and worn so long in the back that if it hinted of Indian blood. In the Senate he preferred clothes that suggested the competent insurance salesman, but when farmer constituents were in Washington, he appeared in an historic 10-gallon hat with a mussy gray cutaway, which somehow you erroneously remembered as the Black Prince Albert. In that costume, he looked like a sawed-off museum model of a medicine show doctor, and indeed it was rumored that during one law school vacation, Buzz Windrip had played the banjo and had done card tricks and handed down medicine bottles and managed the shell game for no less scientific an expedition than old Dr. Allagash's traveling laboratory, which specialized in the Choctaw cancer cure and the Chinook consumption soother, and the oriental remedy for piles and rheumatism prepared from a world-old secret formula by the gypsy princess queen Peshawara. The company, ardently assisted by Buzz, killed off quite a number of persons who, but for their confidence in Dr. Allagash's bottles of water, coloring matter, tobacco juice, and raw corn whiskey, might have gone early enough to the doctors. But since then, Windrip had redeemed himself, no doubt, by ascending from the vulgar fraud of selling bogus medicine, standing in front of a megaphone, to the dignity of selling bogus economics, standing on an indoor platform under mercury vapor lights in front of a microphone. He was in stature but a small man, yet remember that so were Napoleon, Lord Beaverbrook, Stephen A. Douglas, Frederick the Great, and the Dr. Goebbels, who is privily known throughout Germany as Wotan's Mickey Mouse. Dreamus Jessup, so inconspicuous as observer, watching Senator Windrip from so humble a Boeotia, could not explain his power of bewitching large audiences. The senator was vulgar, almost illiterate, a public liar easily detected, and in his ideas almost idiotic, while his celebrated piety was that of a traveling salesman for church furniture, and his yet more celebrated humor the sly cynicism of a country store. Certainly there was nothing exhilarating in the actual words of his speeches, nor anything convincing in his philosophy. His political platforms were only wings of a windmill. 7 years before his present credo, derived from Lee Saracen, Hitler, Gottfried Feder, Rocco, and probably the review of Thee I Sing, little Buzz back home had advocated nothing more revolutionary than better beef stew in the country poor farms and plenty of graft for loyal machine politicians with jobs for their brothers-in-law, nephews, law partners, and creditors. Dreamus had never heard Windrip during one of his orgasms of oratory, but he had been told by political reporters that under the spell you thought Windrip was Plato, but that on the way home you could not remember anything he had said. There were two things, they told Dreamus, that distinguished this prairie Demosthenes. He was an actor of genius. There was no more overwhelming actor on the stage, in the motion pictures, nor even in the pulpit. He would whirl arms, bang tables, glare from mad eyes, vomit biblical wrath from a gaping mouth, but he would also coo like a nursing mother, beseech like an aching lover, and in between tricks would coldly and almost contemptuously jab his crowds with figures and facts that were inescapable, even when, as often happened, they were entirely incorrect. But below this surface stagecraft was his uncommon natural ability to be authentically excited by and with his audience, and they by and with him. He could dramatize his assertion that he was neither a Nazi nor a fascist, but a Democrat, a homespun Jeffersonian, Lincolnian, Clevelandian, Wilsonian Democrat, and sans scenery and costume make you see him veritably defending the capital against barbarian hordes, the while he innocently presented as his own warm-hearted democratic inventions every anti-libertarian, anti-Semitic madness of Europe. Aside from his dramatic glory, Buzz Windrip was a professional, common man. Oh, he was common enough. He had every prejudice and aspiration of every American common man. He believed in the desirability and therefore the sanctity of thick buckwheat cakes with adulterated maple syrup, in rubber trays for the ice cubes in his electric refrigerator, in the especial nobility of dogs, all dogs, in the oracles of S. Parks Cadman, in being chummy with all waitresses at all junction lunchrooms, and in Henry Ford. When he became president, he exulted maybe he could get Mr. Ford to come to supper at the White House. And the superiority of anyone who possessed $1 million. He regarded spats, walking sticks, caviar, titles, tea drinking, poetry not daily syndicated in the newspapers, and all foreigners, possibly excepting the British, as degenerate. But he was the common man, 20 times magnified by his oratory, so that while the other commoners could understand his every purpose, which was exactly the same as their own, they saw him towering among them, and they raised their hands to him in worship. In the greatest of all Native American arts, next to the talkies and those spirituals in which Negroes express their desire to go to heaven, to St. Louis, or almost any place distant from the romantic old plantations, namely in the art of publicity, Lee Saracen was in no way inferior even to such acknowledged masters as Edward Bernays, the late Theodore Roosevelt, Jack Dempsey, and Upton Sinclair. Saracen had, as it was scientifically called, been building up Senator Windrip for 7 years before his nomination as president. Where other senators were encouraged by their secretaries and wives, no potential dictator ever ought to have a visible wife, and none ever has had except Napoleon, to expand from village backslapping to noble, rotund, Ciceronian gestures, Saracen had encouraged Windrip to keep up in the great world all of the clownishness which, along with considerable legal shrewdness and endurance to make 10 speeches a day, had endeared him to his simple-hearted constituents in his native state. Windrip danced a hornpipe before an alarmed academic audience when he got his first honorary degree. He kissed Miss Flangebrough at the South Dakota Beauty Concert. He entertained the Senate, or at least the Senate galleries, with detailed accounts of how to catch catfish, from the bait digging to the ultimate effects of the jug of corn whiskey. He challenged the venerable Chief Justice of the Supreme Court to a duel with slingshots. Though she was not visible, Windrip did have a wife. Saracen had none, nor was likely to, and Walt Trowbridge was a widower. Buzz's lady stayed back home, raising spinach and chickens and telling the neighbors that she expected to go to Washington next year, the while Windrip was informing the press that his Frau was so edifyingly devoted to their 2 small children to Bible study that she simply could not be coaxed to come east. But when it came to assembling a political machine, Windrip had no need of counsel from Lee Saracen. Where Buzz was, there were the vultures also. His hotel suite in the capital city of his home state in Washington, in New York, or in Kansas City was like, well, Frank Sullivan once suggested it resembled the office of a tabloid newspaper upon the impossible occasion of Bishop Cannons setting fire to St. Patrick Cathedral, kidnapping the Dion quintuplets, and eloping with Greta Garbo in a stolen tank. In the parlor of any of these suites, Buzz Windrip sat in the middle of the room, a telephone on the floor beside him, and for hours he shrieked at the instrument, "Hello? Yeah? Speaking?" Or at the door, come in, and sit down, take a load off your feet." And all day, all night, till dawn, he would be bellowing, "Tell him he can take his bill and go climb a tree," or, "Why, certainly, old man, tickled to death to support it. Utility corporation certainly never be getting a raw deal. And you tell the governor I want Kippy elected sheriff, and I want an indictment against him quashed, and I want it damn quick." Usually, squatted there cross-legged, he would be wearing a smart belted camel hair's coat with an atrocious checked cap. In a fury, as he was at least every quarter hour, he would leap up, peel off the overcoat, showing either a white boiled shirt and clerical black bow, or a canary yellow shirt with a scarlet tie, fling it on the floor, and put it on again with slow dignity while he bellowed his anger like Jeremiah cursing Jerusalem, or like a sick cow mourning its kidnapped young. There came to him stockbrokers, labor leaders, distillers, anti-vivisectionists, vegetarians, disbarred shyster lawyers, missionaries to China, lobbyists for oil and electricity, advocates of war and of war against war. Gah! Every guy in the country with a bad case of the gimmies comes to see me, he growled to Saracen. He promised to further their causes, to get an appointment to West Point for their nephew, who had lost his job in the creamery. He promised fellow politicians to support their bills if they would support his. He gave interviews upon subsistence farming, backless bathing suits, and the secret strategy of the Ethiopian army. He grinned and knee-patted and backslapped, and few of his visitors, once they had talked with him, failed to look upon him as their little father and to support him forever. The few who did fail, most of them newspapermen, disliked the smell of him even more than before they had met him. Even they, by the unusual spiritedness and color of their attacks upon him, kept his name alive in every column. By the time he had been a senator for 1 year, his machine was as complete and smooth-running and as hidden away from ordinary passengers as the engines of a liner. On the beds in any of these suites, there would be at the same time 3 top hats, 2 clerical hats, a green object with a feather, a brown derby, a taxi driver's cap, and 9 ordinary Christian brown felts. Once, within 27 minutes, he talked on the telephone from Chicago to Palo Alto, Washington, Buenos Aires, Willamette, and Oklahoma City. Once, in half a day, he received 16 calls from clergymen asking him to condemn the dirty burlesque show, and 7 from theatrical promoters and real estate owners asking him to praise it. He called the clergyman doctor or brother or both. He called the promoters buddy and pal. And he gave equally ringing promises to both, and for both he loyally did nothing whatsoever. Normally, he would not have thought of cultivating foreign alliances, though he never doubted that someday as president he would be the leader of the world orchestra. Leader Saracen insisted that Buzz look into a few international fundamentals, such as the relationship of sterling to the lira, the proper way in which to address a baronet, the chances of the Archduke Otto, the London oyster bars, and the brothels near the Boulevard de Sebastopol, best to recommend to junketing representatives. But the actual cultivation of foreign diplomats resident in Washington he left to Saracen, who entertained them on terrapin and canvas-back duck with black currant jelly, in his apartment that was considerably more tapestried than Buzz's own ostentatiously simple Washington quarters. However, in Saracen's place, a room with a large silk-hung Empire double bed was reserved for Buzz. It was Saracen who had persuaded Windrip to let him write 0 Hour, based on Windrip's own dictated notes, and who had beguiled millions into reading and even thousands into buying that Bible of economic justice. Saracen, who had perceived that there was now such a spate of private political weeklies and monthlies that it was a distinction not to publish one. Saracen, who had the inspiration for Buzz's emergency radio address at 3 a.m. upon the occasion of the Supreme Court's throttling the NRA in May 1935, though not many adherents, including Buzz himself, were quite certain as to whether he was pleased or disappointed, though not many actually heard the broadcast itself. Everyone in the country except sheep herders and Professor Albert Einstein heard about it and was impressed. Yet it was Buzz who all by himself thought of first defending the Duke of York by refusing to appear at the embassy dinner for him in December of 1935, thus gaining in all farm kitchens and parsonages and barrooms a splendid reputation for homespun democracy, and of later mollifying His Highness by calling on him with a touching little home bouquet of geraniums from the hothouse of Japanese ambassador, which endeared him, if not necessarily to royalty, yet certainly to the DAR, the English-speaking Union, and all motherly hearts who thought the pudgy little bunch of geraniums too sweet for anything. By the newspaperman, Buzz was credited with having insisted on the nomination of Pearlie Beecroft for vice president at the Democratic Convention, after Doremus Jessup had frenetically ceased listening. Beecroft was a southern tobacco planter and storekeeper, an ex-governor of his state, married to an ex-schoolteacher from Maine who was sufficiently scented with salt spray and potato blossoms to win any Yankee, but it was not his geographical superiority which made Mr. Beecroft the perfect running mate for Buzz Windrip, but that he was malaria-yellowed and laxly mustached, where Buzz's horsey face was ruddy and smooth, while Beecroft's oratory had a vacuity and a profundity of slowly enunciated nonsense, which beguiled such solemn deacons as were irritated by Buzz's cataract of slang. Nor could Saracen ever have convinced the wealthy that the more Buzz denounced them and promised to distribute their millions to the poor, the more they could trust his common sense and finance his campaign. But with a hint, a grin, a wink, a handshake, Buzz could convince them, and their contributions came in by the hundreds of thousands, often disguised as assessments on imaginary business partnerships. It had been the peculiar genius of Berzelius Windrip not to wait until he should be nominated for this office or that office to begin shanghaiing his band of buccaneers. He had been coaxing in supporters ever since the day when, at age 4, he had captivated a neighborhood comrade by giving him an ammonia pistol, which later he thriftily stole back from his comrade's pocket. Buzz might not have learned, perhaps could not have learned, much from sociologists Charles Beard and John Dewey, but they could have learned a great deal from Buzz. And it was Buzz's, not Saracen's, masterstroke that as warmly as he advocated everyone's getting rich by just voting to be rich, he denounced all fascism and Nazism, so that most of the Republicans who were afraid of democratic fascism and all the Democrats who were afraid of Republican fascism were ready to vote for him. End of Chapter 9. It Can't Happen Here, Chapter 10. While I hate befogging my pages with scientific technicalities and even neologies, I feel constrained to say here that the most elementary perusal of the economy of abundance would convince any intelligent student that the Cassandras, who miscall the much-needed increase in the fluidity of a currential circulation, inflation, erroneously basing their parable upon inflationary misfortunes of certain European nations in the era of 1919 through 1923, fallaciously and perhaps inexcusably fail to comprehend the different monetary status in America inherent in our vastly greater reservoir of natural resources. 0 Hour by Berzelius Windrip. Most of the mortgaged farmers, most of the white-collar workers who had been unemployed these 3 and 4 and 5 years, most of the people on relief rolls who wanted more relief, most of the suburbanites who could not meet the installment payments on electric washing machines, such large sections of the American Legion as believed that only Senator Windrip would secure for them and perhaps increase the bonus, such popular Myrtle Boulevard or Elm Avenue preachers as spurred by the examples of Bishop Prang and Father Coughlin, believed they could get useful publicity out of supporting a slightly queer program that promised prosperity without anyone's having to work for it. The remnants of the Ku Klux Klan and such leaders of the American Federation of Labor as felt they had been inadequately courted and bepromised by the old-line politicians, and the non-unionized common laborers who felt they had been inadequately courted by the same AF of L, Backstreet and over-the-garage lawyers who had never yet wrangled government jobs, the lost legion of the Anti-Saloon League, since it was known that though he drank a lot, Senator Windrip also praised teetotalism a lot, while his rival, Walt Trowbridge, though he drank but little, said nothing at all in support of the messiahs of Prohibition. These messiahs had not found professional morality profitable of late, while the Rockefellers and Wanamakers no longer praying with them nor paying. Besides these necessitous petitioners, a goodish number of burghers who, while they were millionaires, yet maintained that their prosperity had been sorely checked by the fiendishness of the bankers in limiting their credit. These were the supporters who looked to Berzelius Windrip to play the divine raven and feed them handsomely when he should become president. And from such came most of the fervid elocutionist who campaigned for him through September and October. Pushing in among this mob of camp followers who identified political virtue with money for their rent came a flying squad who suffered not from hunger but from congested idealism, intellectuals and reformers, and even rugged individualists who saw in Winthrop, for all his clownish swindlerism, a free vigor which promised a rejuvenation of the crippled and senile capitalistic system. Upton Sinclair wrote about Buzz and spoke for him, just as in 1917, unyielding pacifist though he was, Mr. Sinclair had advocated America's wholehearted prosecution of the Great War, foreseeing that it would unquestionably exterminate German militarism and thus forever end all wars. Most of the Morgan partners, though they may have shuddered a little at association with Upton Sinclair, saw that, however much income they themselves might have to sacrifice, only Winthrop could start the business recovery, while Bishop Manning of the New York City pointed out that Winthrop always spoke reverently of the church and its shepherds, whereas Walt Trowbridge went horseback riding every Sabbath morning and had never been known to telegraph any female relative on Mother's Day. On the other hand, the Saturday Evening Post enraged the small shopkeepers by calling Winthrop a demagogue, and the New York Times, once independent Democrat, was anti-Winthrop. But most of the religious periodicals announced that with a saint like Bishop Prang for a backer, Winthrop must have been called of God. Even Europe joined in, with the most modest friendliness explaining that they wished not to intrude on American domestic politics, but only to express personal admiration for that great Western advocate of peace and prosperity, Berzelius Winthrop. There came representatives of certain foreign powers lecturing throughout the land. General Balbo, so popular here because of his leadership of the flight from Italy to Chicago in 1933. A scholar who, though he now lived in Germany, was an inspiration to all patriotic leaders of German recovery, yet had graduated from Harvard University and had been the most popular piano player in his class, namely Dr. Ernst Putzi Hanfenstangl, and Great Britain's lion of diplomacy, the Gladstone of the 1930s, the handsome and gracious Lord Lossiemouth, who, as Prime Minister, had been known as the Right Honourable Ramsay MacDonald, P.C. All three of them were expensively entertained by the wives of manufacturers, and they persuaded many millionaires who, in the refinement of wealth, had considered Buzz vulgar, that actually he was the world's one hope of efficient international commerce. Father Coughlin took one look at all the candidates and indignantly retired to his cell. Mrs. Adelaide Tarr Gimmich, who would surely have written to the friend she had made at the Rotary dinner in Fort Beulah, if she could only have remembered the name of the town, was a considerable figure in the campaign. She explained to women voters how kind it was of Senator Winthrop to let them go on voting so far, and she sang Berzelius Winthrop's Gone to Wash an average of 11 times a day. Buzz himself, Bishop Prang, Senator Porkwood, the fearless liberal and friend of labor and the farmers, and Colonel Osceola Luthorn, the editor, though their prime task was reaching millions by radio, also in a 40-day train trip traveled over 27,000 miles through every state in the Union on the scarlet and silver, ebony-paneled, silk-upholstered, streamlined, diesel-engined, rubber-padded, air-conditioning, aluminum Forgotten Men special. It had a private bar that was forgotten by none save the bishop. The train fares were the generous gift of the combined railways. Over 600 speeches were discharged, ranging from the 8-minute hellos delivered to crowds gathered at stations to 2-hour fulminations in auditoriums and fairgrounds. Buzz was present at every speech, usually starring, but sometimes so hoarse that he could only wave his hand and croak, "Howdy, folks!" while he was spelled by Prang, Porkwood, Colonel Luthorn, or such volunteers from his regiment of secretaries, doctoral consulting specialists in history and economics, cooks, bartenders, and barbers as could be lured away from playing craps with the accompanying reporters, photographers, sound recorders, and broadcasters. Teifer of the United Press had estimated that Buzz thus appeared personally before more than 2 million persons. Meanwhile, almost daily hurtling by aeroplane between Washington and Buzz's home, Lee Saracen supervised dozens of telephone girls and scores of girl stenographers who answered thousands of daily telephone calls and letters and telegrams and cables and boxes containing poisoned candy. Buzz himself had made the rule that all these girls must be pretty, reasonably, thoroughly skilled, and related to people with political influence. For Saracen, it must be said that in this bedlam of public relations, he never once used contact as a transitive verb. The Honorable Pearlie Beecroft, vice presidential candidate, specialized on the conventions of fraternal orders, religious denominations, insurance agents, and traveling men. Colonel Dewey Hake, who had nominated Buzz at Cleveland, had an assignment unique in campaigning one of Saracen's slickest inventions. Hake spoke for Winthrop not in the most frequented, most obvious places, but at places so unusual that his appearance there made news, and Saracen and Hake saw to it that there were nimble chroniclers present to get that news. Flying in his own plane, covering 1,000 miles a day, he spoke to 9 astonished miners whom he caught in a copper mine a mile below the surface, while 39 photographers snapped the 9. He spoke from a motorboat to a stilled fishing fleet during a fog in Gloucester Harbor. He spoke from the steps of the sub-treasury at noon on Wall Street. He spoke to the aviators and ground crew at Shushan Airport, New Orleans, and even the flyers were ribald only for the first 5 minutes till he had described Buzz Winthrop's gallant but ludicrous efforts to learn to fly. He spoke to state policemen, to stamp collectors, players of chess and secret clubs, and steeplejacks at work. He spoke in breweries, hospitals, magazine office, cathedrals, crossroad churches, 40 by 30, prisons, lunatic asylums, nightclubs, till the art editors began to send photographers the memo, "For Pete's sake, no more photos, Colonel Hake spieling in sporting houses in the Hooskow." Yet went on using the pictures. For Colonel Dewey Hake was a figure as sharp-lighted almost as Buzz Winthrop himself, son of a decayed Tennessee family with one Confederate general grandfather and one Dewey of Vermont. He had picked cotton, become a youthful telegraph operator, worked his way through the University of Arkansas and the University of Missouri Law School, settled as a lawyer in Wyoming Village and then Oregon, and during the war, he was in 1936 but 44 years old, served in France as captain of infantry with credit. Returned to America, he had been elected to Congress and became a colonel in the militia. He studied military history, he learned to fly, to box, to fence. He was a ramrod-like figure, yet had a fairly amiable smile. He was liked equally by disciplinary army officers of high rank and by such roughnecks as Mr. Shad Ledoux, the Caliban of Doremus Jessup. Hake brought to Buzz's fold the very picaroons whom he had most snickered at Bishop Prang's solemnity. And this while Hector McGoblin, the cultured doctor and burly boxing fan, co-author with Saracen of the campaign anthem "Bring Out the Old-Time Musket," was specializing in the inspiration of college professors, associations of high school teachers, professional baseball teams, training camps of pugilists, medical meetings, summer schools in which well-known authors taught the art of writing to earnest aspirants who could never learn to write, golf tournaments, and all such cultural congresses. But the pugilistic Dr. McGoblin came nearer to danger than any other campaigner. During a meeting in Alabama, where he had satisfactorily proved that no Negro with less than 25% white blood can ever rise to the cultural level of a patent medicine salesman, the meeting was raided. The costly residence section of the whites was raided by a band of colored people headed by a Negro who had been a corporal on the Western Front in 1918. McGoblin and the town were saved by the eloquence of a colored clergyman. Truly, as Bishop Prang said, the apostles of Senator Winthrop were now preaching his message unto all manner of men, even unto the heathen. But what Doremus Jessup said to Buck Titus and Father Perfix was, "This is revolutionary in terms of Rotary." End of chapter 10. It Can't Happen Here, chapter 11. When I was a kid one time, I had an old maid teacher that used to tell me, "Buzz, you're the thickest-headest dunce in school." But I noticed that she told me this a whole lot oftener than she used to tell the other kids how smart they were. And I came to be the most talked-about scholar in the whole township. The United States Senate isn't so different. And I want to thank a lot of stuffed shirts for their remarks about yours truly. 0 Hour, Basilius Windrip. But there were certain of the heathen who did not heed those heralds praying in Windrip and Hake and Dr. McGoblin. Walt Trowbridge conducted his campaign as placidly as though he were certain to win. He did not spare himself, but he did not moan over the forgotten men. He'd been one himself as a youngster and didn't think it was so bad. Nor become hysterical at a private bar and scarlet and silver special train. Quietly, steadfastly, speaking on the radio and in a few great halls, he explained that he did advocate an enormously improved distribution of wealth, but that it must be achieved by steadily digging and not by dynamite that would destroy more than it excavated. He wasn't particularly thrilling. Economics rarely are, except when they have been dramatized by a bishop, staged and lighted by a Saracen, and passionately played by a Buzz Windrip with rapier and blue satin tights. For the campaign, the communists had brightly brought out their sacrificial candidates. In fact, all 7 of the current communist parties had, since if they had all stuck together they might entice 900,000 votes. They had avoided such bourgeois grossness by enthusiastic schisms, and their creeds now included the Party, the Majority Party, the Leftist Party, the Trotsky Party, the Christian Communist Party, the Workers' Party, and the less baldly named something called the American Nationalistic, Patriotic, Cooperative, Fabian, Post-Marxian Communist Party. It sounded like the names of royalty, but was otherwise dissimilar. But these radical excursions were not very significant compared with the new Jeffersonian Party, suddenly fathered by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 48 hours after the nomination of Windrip at Cleveland, President Roosevelt had issued his defiance. Senator Windrip, he asserted, has been chosen not by the brains and hearts of genuine Democrats, but by their temporary crazed emotions. He would no more support Windrip because he claimed to be a Democrat than he would support Jimmy Walker. Yet, he said, he could not vote for the Republican Party, the party of entrenched special privilege, however much in the past 3 years he had appreciated the loyalty, the honesty, the intelligence of Senator Walt Trowbridge. Roosevelt made it clear that his Jeffersonian or true Democratic faction was not a third party in the sense that it was to be permanent. It was to vanish as soon as honest and coolly thinking men got control again of the old organization. Buzz Windrip aroused mirth by dubbing it the Bull Mouse Party, but President Roosevelt was joined by almost all the liberal members of Congress, Democratic or Republican, who had not followed Walt Trowbridge, by Norman Thomas and the socialists who had not turned communist, by Governors Floyd Olson and Olin Johnston, and by Mayor LaGuardia. The conspicuous fault of the Jeffersonian Party, like the personal fault of Senator Trowbridge, was that it represented integrity and reason in a year when the electorate hungered for frisky emotions, for the peppery sensations associated usually not with monetary systems and taxation rates, but with baptism by immersion in the creek, young love under the elms, straight whiskey, angelic orchestras heard soaring down from the full moon, fear of death when an automobile teeters above a canyon, thirst in a desert and quenching it with spring water, all the primitive sensations which they thought they found in the screaming of Buzz Windrip. Far from the hot-lighted ballrooms where all these crimson-tunicked bandmasters skrill-squabbled as to which should lead for the moment that tremendous spiritual jazz, far off in the cool hills, a little man named Doremus Jessup, who wasn't even a bass drummer but only a citizen editor, wondered in confusion what he should do to be saved. He wanted to follow Roosevelt and the Jeffersonian Party, partly for admiration of the man, partly for the pleasure of shocking the ingrown republicanism of Vermont, but he could not believe that Jeffersonians would have a chance. He did believe that, for all the mothball odor of many of his associates, Walt Trowbridge was a valiant and competent man, and night and day Doremus bounced up and down Beulah Valley campaigning for Trowbridge. Out of his very confusion there came into his writing a desperate sureness which surprised accustomed readers of the Informer. For once he was not amused and tolerant. Though he never said anything worse of the Jeffersonian Party than that it was ahead of its time, in both editorials and news stories he went after Buzz Windrip and his gang with whips, turpentine, and scandal. In person, He was into and out of shops and houses all morning long, arguing with voters, getting miniature interviews. He had expected that traditionally Republican Vermont would give him too drearily easy a task in preaching Trowbridge. What he found was a dismaying preference for the theoretically Democratic Buzz Windrip, and that preference, Doremus perceived, wasn't even a pathetic trust in Windrip's promises of utopian bliss for everyone in general. It was a trust in increased cash for the voter himself and for his family very much in particular. Most of them had, among all the factors in the campaign, noticed only what they regarded as Windrip's humor and the three planks of his platform: 5, which promised to increase taxes on the rich; 10, which condemned the Negroes, since nothing so elevates a dispossessed farmer or factory worker on relief as to have some race, any race, on which he can look down; and especially 11, which announced or seemed to announce that the average toiler would immediately receive $5,000 a year. And ever so many railway station debaters explained that it would really be $10,000. Why, they were even going to have every cent offered by Dr. Townsend, plus everything planned by the late Huey Long, Upton Sinclair, and the Utopians, all put together. So beatifically did hundreds of old people in Beulah Valley believe this that they smilingly trotted into Raymond Pridewell's hardware store to order new kitchen stoves and aluminum saucepans and complete bathroom furnishings to be paid for on the day after inauguration. Mr. Pridewell, the cobwebbed old Henry Cabot Lodge Republican, lost half his trade by chasing out these happy heirs to fabulous estates, but they went on dreaming, and Doremus, nagging at them, discovered that mere figures are defenseless against a dream, even a dream of new Plymouths and unlimited cans of sausage and motion picture cameras and the prospect of never having to arise till 7:30 a.m. Thus answered Alfred Tesra, Snake Tesra, friend to Doremus's handyman Shad Ledoux. Snake was a steel-tough truck driver and taxi owner who had several sentences for assault and for transporting bootleg liquor. He had once made a living catching rattlesnakes and copperheads in southern New England. Under President Windrip, Snake jeeringly assured Doremus that he would have enough money to start a chain of roadhouses in all the dry communities in Vermont. Ed Howland, one of the lesser Fort Bueller grocers, and Charlie Betts, furniture and undertaking, while they were dead against anyone getting groceries, furniture, or even undertaking on Windrip credit, were all for the population's having credit on other wares. Eris Dilly, a squatter dairy farmer living with a toothless wife and 7 slattern children in a tilted and unscrubbed cabin way up on Mount Terror, snarled at Doremus, who had often taken food baskets and boxes of shotgun shells and masses of cigarettes to Eris. Well, want to tell you, when Mr. Windrip gets in, we farmers are going to fix our own prices on our crops and not you smart city fellows. Doremus could not blame him. While Buck Titus at 50 looked 30-odd, Eris at 34 looked 50. Lorinda Pike's singularly unpleasant partner in the Beulah Valley Tavern, one Mr. Nipper, whom she hoped soon to lose, combined boasting how rich he was with gloating how much more he was going to get under Windrip. Professor Stobmeyer quoted nice things that Windrip had said about higher pay for teachers. Louis Rottenstern, to prove that his heart at least was not Jewish, became more lyric than any of them, and even Frank Tasbro of the quarries, Maderi Coal of the grist mill and real estate holdings, R.C. Crowley of the bank, who presumably were not tickled by projects of higher income taxes, smiled pussy-cattishly and hinted that Windrip was a lot sounder fellow than people knew. But no one in Fort Beulah was a more active crusader for Buzz Windrip than Shad Ledoux. Doremus had known that Shad possessed talent for argument and for display, that he had once persuaded old Mr. Pridewell to trust him for a .22 rifle, value $23, that, removed from the spear of coal bins and grass-stained overalls, he had once sung Rollicky Bill the Sailor at a smoker of the ancient and independent Order of the Rams, and that he had enough memory to be able to quote, as his own profound opinions, the editorials in Hearst newspapers. Yet even knowing all this equipment for a political career, an equipment not much short of Buzz Windrip's, Doremus was surprised to find Shad soapboxing for Windrip among the quarry workers, then actually as chairman of a rally in Oddfellows Hall. Shad spoke little, but with brutal taunting of the believers in Trowbridge and Roosevelt. At meetings where he did not speak, Shad was an incomparable bouncer, and in that valued capacity he was summoned to Winthrop's rallies as far away as Burlington. It was he who, in a militia uniform, handsomely riding a large white plow horse, led the final Winthrop parade in Rutland, and substantial men of affairs, even dry goods jobbers, fondly called him Shad. Doremus was amazed, felt a little apologetic over his failure to have appreciated this newfound paragon as he sat in American Legion Hall and heard Shad bellowing, "I don't pretend to be anything but a plain working stiff, but there's 40 million workers like me. And we know that Senator Winthrop is the first statesman in years that thinks of what guys like us need before he thinks one doggone thing about politics. Come on, you bozos. The swell folks tell you not to be selfish. Walt Drawbridge tells you not to be selfish. Well, be selfish and vote for one man that's willing to give you something. Give you something. And not just grab off every cent and every hour of work that he can get." Doremus groaned inwardly, "Oh, my Shad, and you're doing most of this on my time." Sissy Jessup sat on the running board of her coupe, hers by squatter's right, with Julian Falk up from Amherst for the weekend and Malcolm Tasbro wedged in on either side of her. "Oh, nuts, let's just quit talking politics. Winthrop's going to be elected, so why waste time yodeling when we could drive down to the river and have a swim," complained Malcolm. "He's not going to win without our putting up a tough scrap against him. I'm going to talk to the high school alumni this evening about how they get to tell their parents to vote for either Trowbridge or Roosevelt," snapped Julian Falk. "Ha ha 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 ha, and of course the parents will be tickled to death to do whatever you tell them, Julian. You college men certainly are the goods. Besides, want to be serious about this fool business?" Malcolm had the insolent self-assurance of beef slick black hair and a large car of his own. He was the perfect leader of black shirts, and he looked contemptuously on Julian, who, though a year older, was pale and thinnish. "Matter of fact, it'll be a good thing to have Buzz. He'll put a damn quick stop to all this radicalism, all this free speech, and libel of most of our fundamental institutions." "Boston American, last Tuesday, page 8, murmured Sissy. "And no wonder you're scared of him, Julian. He sure will drag some of your favorite Amherst anarchist profs off to the hoosegow, and maybe you too, comrade." The two young men looked at each other with slow fury. Sissy quieted them by raging, "For heaven's sake, will you two heels quit scrapping? Oh, my dears, this beastly election, beastly. Seems as if it's breaking up every town, every home. My poor dad. Doremus is just about all in." End of chapter 11.